Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are wrestling with a question that's really central to understanding high-stakes global politics. How do you properly define political opposition when you're dealing with a dictatorship like Iran?
It's a really, really important distinction to make because the word opposition here in the West is, well, it's benign, it implies a party that holds seats and just waits for the next election.
Right.
But when you're dealing with an autocracy, that word takes on an entirely different and usually lethal meaning.
And the source material we've gathered for this deep dive gives us a sharp, almost scientific way to look at this. A framework for judging who is a legitimate, power-threatening alternative and who is just playing a role.
A role that might even be dictated by the regime itself.
Okay, so let's unpack this for you. We've all heard that old saying, the duck test, right? If it looks like a duck, swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, well, it's probably a duck. But our sources are suggesting that in a place like Tehran, the regime is actively fitting a duck costume onto certain figures. Specifically, someone like Reza Pahlavi, who the source claims is acting as a kind of political proxy for the regime for Khamenei.
And that's the core tension we're looking at today, the public image versus the scientific reality, according to these sources. They're just completely divergent. Conventional wisdom just doesn't apply when the state controls the entire narrative.
So our mission today is to cut through all that noise. We're going to pull apart the scientific criteria for what makes an opposition in political science. We'll distinguish between those who pay the real cost and those who benefit from the distraction.
And then we apply those metrics directly to the key actors to see who really fits the bill.
And who's failing the test?
So to start, we really have to establish the two main definitions of opposition from a political science standpoint. The first one is the classical definition. It's what opposition means in a healthy, functioning democracy.
That's the model most of us picture when we hear the word.
Exactly. And it's defined as a set of organized forces that operate outside of formal power. They're aiming to change or contain the ruling power, and it rests on three key components.
Okay.
First, they had to be genuinely outside of formal power, so they don't control the government, the official institutions, none of that.
So, like the opposition benches in parliament, they exist, they have some power, but they aren't the government.
Precisely. Second, and this is critical, they must be tangibly organized. They need a foundation, a structure, a clear program, a strategy, and an accountable leadership. This isn't just, hashtag movement.
It needs continuity.
It needs continuity. Yeah. And third, they have to have a clear political goal, whether that's reform or substitution of the government through an election or a transition to a whole new order.
That makes perfect sense for a stable society. But you said that in a dictatorship, those rules get thrown out.
They're not just thrown out. They're completely inverted. And this brings us to the real definition of opposition against an autocracy. The rules of the game are defined by the regime's response to you, not by your platform. And you have to meet three very distinct, very costly criteria.
What's the first one?
First, you have to pose a genuine threat. This isn't about being an annoying rival. The regime has to see you as an existential life or death danger to its own survival. If they can tolerate you, you're not a threat.
That's a huge filter right there. And the second one, honestly, it's the most chilling part of this whole analysis.
It's the acid test of real resistance. You must pay the cost. This is non-negotiable. You have to suffer suppression, face prison, torture, execution, and you have to be the permanent target of the regime's demonization campaigns. If you're not paying that price, you are, by definition, not a serious threat.
Just that single idea, paying the cost, it makes you realize how shallow a lot of Western political commentary can be, doesn't it? I mean, if you applied that rule globally, how many so-called opposition leaders would instantly disqualify themselves?
It radically shifts your perception. And that leads to the third feature. You must maintain an independent organization, one that the regime can't just play with or infiltrate or co-opt.
Just they can't pull its strings.
They can't pull its strings. The organization has to be independent. That's vital.
Okay, so independence, existential threat, and cost payment. If we apply those strict criteria, where does our source material lead us?
The sources immediately pivot to assessing the National Council of Resistance of Iran, the NCRI, and the Mojahedin, or MEK. And importantly, the material notes they prefer the terms resistance and alternative in Farsi rather than opposition.
Why is that?
Because they want to replace the entire structure, not just oppose it from within some kind of imagined system.
Okay, so let's dig into the 4 pillars the sources use to define this real alternative. The first one is about the nature of the conflict itself.
Right. The first pillar is what the sources call an antagonistic contradiction. This isn't just a political disagreement. It means the conflict is completely irreconcilable. They cannot coexist.
It's a zero-sum game.
Exactly. The regime knows one of them must be physically eliminated. There's no middle ground, no negotiation, which is why the regime spends all its resources trying to wipe them out.
Which brings us to the evidence. How have they met that cost payment criterion over time?
That's the second pillar, sustained, organized cost payment. We're talking about 4 decades of constant professional struggle. The sources cite tens of thousands of prisoners, mass executions, victims of terror, and it continues without summer or Christmas breaks.
That points to a deep organizational capability that mere rivals just wouldn't have.
Which is the third pillar, an enduring organization under repression. The sheer longevity of the organization, despite these constant attacks, is chalked up to its popular base, its disciplined structure, and the fact that its leadership is replaced seamlessly when key figures are executed.
And finally, the 4th pillar. This is maybe the most quantifiable and, frankly, shocking measure of threat in this entire deep dive.
It's the permanent focus of the security apparatus. The principle here is profound. Dictators don't measure their real enemy by what the enemy says on TV. They measure them by the volume of energy and suppression budget they spend on them. The budget is the receipt.
And this is where it gets really interesting. What specific numbers did the sources give us?
The explicit claim, which is extraordinary, is that a staggering 70 to 80% of the intelligence ministry's entire budget and resources, plus vast media and propaganda funds, we're talking films, book clips, are directed specifically at undermining the MEK and NCRI, both inside and outside Iran.
Hold on, 80%? That sounds like a fantastical claim. Does the source offer any methodology for that, or is this a claim made by the resistance?
The source presents this as the definitive assessment from the resistance leadership based on their information and visible expenditures. But look, regardless of the exact number, the implication is what matters. The regime sees this single group as the primary existential threat, justifying what one leader called the censorship of the century. All that money is the proof.
Okay. So if the NCRI and MEK meet these criteria for being the real opposition, we have to turn to the figures who claim to be opposition but fail that test. Let's talk about Reza Pahlavi. The sources put him in the same category as, say, Ahmadinejad or Rouhani, in terms of actual effectiveness against the dictatorship.
Right. He's seen as a proxy figure. And the scientific criteria explain exactly why he's excluded from the category of a real alternative. He fails on multiple fronts.
How does he fail the threat criterion?
That's the first failure. Zero threat, net help. He doesn't threaten the regime's survival. In fact, the source claims he actively helps it survive by creating a counter-narrative and, crucially, attacking other opponents of the regime.
So he acts as a political lightning rod, basically. He absorbs all that revolutionary energy and redirects it somewhere safe.
Precisely, which leads directly to his second failure. He has no organizational target. He pays no cost. Because he lacks a real durable structure for the regime to strike, he incurs zero structural cost. The regime can't imprison his cadres because, well, he doesn't have any.
And if they can't strike your organization, they don't have to spend that 70 or 80% of the budget we were just talking about. What about accountability?
The accountability gap. That's the third failure. He's entirely media-centric.
Yeah.
His presence is manufactured by media appearances, not by any kind of grassroots organization. And his constant shifting of organizational names like Phoenix, then the Iranian National Council, is seen as a deliberate move.
A political shell corporation? Why?
Because it's untraceable. The sources argue this tactic is dictated by the intelligence ministry. It ensures that if he's ever held accountable, the trail leads back to them, not to an independent movement. The regime controls the brand and can just discard it.
So there's a huge strategic benefit for the regime to keep him in the spotlight. Why him?
It's about strategic depth. The regime's main diplomatic operatives have been, burned or exposed internationally. They need a fresh, palatable face.
So RP serves as a political proxy abroad. He represents a non-threatening alternative, kind of like how Hezbollah or the Houthis are military proxies in the region.
It's exactly. He's designed to project an image of internal dissent that is ultimately completely harmless to the regime. And the source includes a really crucial quote that just dissolves any ambiguity about his commitment to paying the cost.
What's that?
RP himself said in an interview that he prioritizes his own freedom and life abroad, confirming he would not take over even if the regime fell.
That's a radical confirmation that he fails the acid test. It also explains the weird contradictions in his messaging. The source says the only way it makes sense is if you realize he and the regime aren't separate. They're reading from the same script.
And once you understand that, the focus shifts from the military front to the narrative war.
The
regime knows if it can't defeat the true alternative militarily, it has to defeat them narratively.
And this is where we see certain media outlets come into play, like Iran International, Menoto, BBC Farsi.
The source material is very blunt here. It says the media's editorial line is heavily influenced by its investors, described as colonial powers, reactionary Arabs, or hardline Israelis, whose interests often overlap with the intelligence ministry's goal of just containing the real threat.
And that leads to framing, right? Selectively editing reality.
Yes. They perform content engineering. They guide the audience by cutting real anti-regime slogans like Death to Khamenei and inserting fabricated Pahlavi-aligned slogans like Javed Shah.
The recent bazaar protests are a perfect case study of this, aren't they?
Absolutely. The historical significance of the bazaar is huge. It's not just a market. It's a deep, non-governmental political institution. It funded revolutions.
Look, it's conservative by nature. It wants to protect its capital.
Exactly. It's the last major institution to join any protest. So when the bazaar joins in, it's a massive deal. It accelerates the coefficient of overthrow. And that is precisely why the regime targets these protests with fake narratives and audio overdubs to dilute their significance.
So, if the regime is faking the narrative about the economy, what about faking the narrative about the opposition's internal cohesion?
And that brings us to the next point. The media coverage of the supposed conflict within the opposition. The source argues this narrative is primarily a security and media project designed to do one thing: obscure the real threat, the NCRI and MEK, and weaken everyone by making them fight each other.
The goal is to create this illusion that the opposition is disorganized and fractured.
Correct. And we see proof in the Mashhad incident cited in the source. RP explicitly thanked the forces chanting Javed Shah, who were attacking anti-regime protesters. The analysis claims this proves he relies on what the source identifies as regime security agents for his base.
What about the stunt by Ali Karimi where he posted pictures of Maryam Rajavi?
That's seen as a deliberate trap set by the intelligence ministry. By forcing genuine opponents to take a public stance for or against the MEK, the regime makes them divert their energy. Instead of focusing on overthrow, they waste time denying associations or arguing about the past. It's a very effective energy drain.
So, if we reject that artificial conflict, what does real unity look like?
The source argues there's no serious ideological conflict among the real opposition about the immediate goal, which is overthrow. So unity has to be based on 3 pre-overthrow agreements, regardless of their final ideology.
Okay, number 1 must be the common goal.
The absolute overthrow of the regime and freedom for Iran. No reform, no negotiation.
And the common method.
Accepting the necessary confrontational language and the commitment to cost payment. This rejects the idea of civil activities that might take, as one figure in the source said, 700 years to succeed. You have to commit to confrontation.
And the third, most important pillar to avoid repeating history.
The guarantee against the reproduction of autocracy. You have to ensure power isn't centralized in one person or one group again. That framework, goal, method, and guarantee, that's the acid test for identifying a genuine opponent.
And finally, for you, the listener, the sources warn against relaying fake news, even if it seems like it might help the cause. Just one piece of fabricated news made by the regime can be used to damage the credibility of the entire movement.
Vigilance is everything. When the real fight is between a genuine alternative and a huge propaganda network designed to create confusion, your own discernment is the last line of defense.
You know, what stands out to me the most is just the clarity you get from applying this scientific definition. Against a dictatorship, you need an existential threat, you need cost payment, and you need independence. It's a powerful lesson in looking past the media spectacle.
If you aren't paying the cost, someone else is. Or you're just a distraction. That price tag tells the whole story.
The source notes that real unity among opponents, which is lacking right now, will naturally increase as things get closer to a revolution. So if the real opposition can unify based on those 3 pillars, goal, method, and guarantee, what is the single biggest threat or obstacle the regime has left to deploy to prevent that unity? That's the strategic question we leave you with for this deep dive.